I never thought a quiet evening at home could unravel everything I thought I understood about my life, my family, and even myself. But that night, what happened that night, was something I never could have anticipated. It was strange and disorienting, a moment that would leave a mark on me in ways I still can't fully explain. My name is Peter, and for most of my 43 years, I believed I had life figured out. I was a hard-working man who had built a stable, happy life with my wife Laura. 18 years of marriage had brought their fair share of challenges, but we always weathered them together. We had two children. Clara, our oldest, was off at college, full of fire and ambition, while Ethan, our 19-year-old son, still lived at home as he attended community college. Ethan was the quiet one. Where Clara was all energy and chaos, Ethan was thoughtful, reserved, and content in his own company. He spent hours tinkering in his room, lost in books or projects that seemed to consume his attention. Laura and I often joked about the balance he brought to the family dynamic, but I always worried, quietly, in the back of my mind, that his calm demeanor might also mean he felt overlooked or overshadowed. Over the years, I'd noticed little changes in Ethan. His easy smiles became rarer, his glances more fleeting. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me, his gaze unreadable, as though he was searching for something he couldn't quite name. I chalked it up to the awkwardness of growing up, the discomfort of being caught between childhood and adulthood, and tried not to overthink it. Laura had been out of town on one of her frequent work trips, leaving just Ethan and me in the house. It was a familiar routine by now. Laura's job with an events company meant she was often away for days at a time, attending conferences or meetings, and I had grown used to holding down the fort. That first night after dinner, Ethan seemed quieter than usual. We sat across from each other, eating in near silence, the hum of the dishwasher in the background. "You good, bud?" I asked, breaking the quiet. His fork paused mid-air for a moment before he shrugged. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice light but unconvincing. I frowned. "You sure? You seem a little off." He gave me a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm just tired," he said. I let it go, not wanting to push. Ethan had always been the kind of kid who opened up in his own time, and I figured he'd talk to me if something was really wrong. We cleared the table and I went to bed not long after. Laura's absence made the room feel emptier than usual. Her side of the bed was cold, untouched, and I found myself missing her voice, the warmth of her presence beside me. Sometime in the night, I woke to the faint creak of the bedroom door opening. My eyes flickered open, adjusting to the darkness as my heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it might be Laura. Maybe she'd come home early without telling me. "Laura?" I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. There was no response, only the soft rustle of fabric and the quiet sound of someone moving closer. My mind, still groggy, struggled to process what was happening. Then, I felt the mattress dip slightly under the weight of someone sitting down. I blinked, my vision adjusting to the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the blinds. And that's when I saw him. It wasn't Laura. It was Ethan. "Ethan?" I said, my voice a mix of confusion and alarm. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. His hand, warm and tentative, rested on my leg, just for a moment. It was a gesture that felt eerily familiar, like something Laura might do to ground me, to reassure me she was there. But this wasn't Laura. And the way Ethan's hand lingered, the hesitation in his movements, sent my thoughts spiraling in directions I didn't want to explore. His face was partially shadowed, but I could see the tension in his expression, the nervous flicker in his eyes. "Is everything okay?" I asked, sitting up now. My pulse was racing, though I wasn't sure why. "I—" he started, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Then why are you—" I began, but he cut me off. I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. I stared at him, bewildered. "Ethan, it's the middle of the night. I'm fine. You should be in bed." For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, looking at me like he wanted to say something more, something he couldn't quite bring himself to say. Then, his shoulders slumped, and he took a step back. "Yeah," he murmured. "Sorry. I'll go." I watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him, and for a long time, I just lay there staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What had that been about? Why had he come into my room like that? And why did it leave me feeling so unsettled? The next morning, I found Ethan in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Morning?" he said, his voice casual but tight. "Morning," I replied, studying him for a moment. The events of the night before hung between us like an unspoken secret. I wanted to ask him about it, to understand what had driven him into my room in the middle of the night. But the words caught in my throat, and the moment passed. And yet, as I went about my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I didn't yet have the words to name. The house was cloaked in its usual nighttime stillness, but something about the quiet felt heavier than usual. Laura was out of town again on one of her frequent work trips, leaving the house feeling emptier than it ever had. I'd grown used to her absence during these trips over the years, but this time, it gnawed at me in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the realization that the kids weren't kids anymore. Clara was away at college, and Ethan, quiet, introspective Ethan, was the only one left to fill the gaps. Ethan had always been reserved, content to stay in his room tinkering with gadgets or buried in a book. I often wondered if he felt overlooked, overshadowed by Clara's bold, vibrant presence. But whenever I asked, he'd give me that same small, reassuring smile and say, "I'm fine, Dad. Don't worry." Still, lately, I'd noticed subtle changes. His smiles were rarer, and his glances lingered in ways I couldn't quite decipher. I'd catch him looking at me with an expression that was searching, almost pleading, before he'd quickly look away. I chalked it up to the awkwardness of growing up, a phase he'd eventually grow out of, and left it at that. That night started like any other. Dinner was quiet, just the two of us, and I tried to draw him into conversation. He answered politely, but his responses were clipped, his attention elsewhere. "You okay, bud?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "Yeah," he replied with a faint shrug. "Just tired." I let it go, sensing he didn't want to talk. Later, as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The empty space beside me, where Laura should have been, only amplified the unease. I drifted into a restless sleep, the house settling into its usual nighttime rhythm. It must have been around midnight when I woke to the faint creak of my bedroom door opening. My heart jumped, and I squinted into the darkness, disoriented. "Laura?" I mumbled instinctively, my voice heavy with sleep. But it wasn't Laura. A figure hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside, the faint glow of moonlight revealing Ethan's familiar silhouette. "Ethan?" I said, sitting up slightly. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the edge of the bed and sat down, his posture tense, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't mean to wake you." I frowned, my concern growing. "It's okay, but why are you here? Did something happen?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the hem of his shirt. "No, I just—" He trailed off, struggling to find the words. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "I didn't want to be alone." There was a vulnerability in his voice that hit me like a punch to the gut. For all his quiet strength, he was still just a kid navigating a world that often felt too big, too overwhelming. "It's all right," I said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Ethan. I'm here." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. But there was something in his eyes, something unspoken, that lingered, making the air between us feel charged in a way I couldn't quite understand. "Come on," I said after a moment, patting the empty space beside me. "If it helps, you can stay here for a bit, but only if you promise to actually sleep." He hesitated, then gave a small, hesitant smile. "Okay." Ethan lay down on the other side of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. I turned off the light, trying to ignore the strange swirl of emotions stirring inside me. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, and despite the oddness of the situation, I felt a strange sense of comfort having him there. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke again in the middle of the night, my senses prickling with awareness. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me, but then I felt it. A light, hesitant touch on my arm. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice groggy. He didn't respond, but his hand lingered, brushing softly against my skin. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate, that my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to say something to break the spell, but I couldn't move. "Dad," he murmured finally, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I turned my head to look at him, my heart pounding. His face was inches from mine, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing that I couldn't ignore. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. I don't know." The silence between us was thick, heavy with tension and something unspoken. Then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my cheek in a gesture so fleeting, so gentle, it left me stunned. "Ethan," I began, but my voice faltered. He pulled back, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have done that. I'll go." Before I could stop him, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness and leaving me alone with the weight of what had just happened. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced. I didn't know what to think, what to feel, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this, whatever it was. Not anymore. The following day was marked by an uncomfortable stillness. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept wandering back to that moment with Ethan. The hesitation in his touch, the whispered apology that felt like an attempt to bridge a chasm neither of us fully understood, and that fleeting kiss on my cheek. It lingered in my thoughts, occupying every crevice of my mind. The weight of it was too much to ignore, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. Not yet. Ethan, for his part, kept his distance. He stayed locked in his room, the door shut, and I respected that space, telling myself he needed time to process whatever had transpired. But as the hours dragged on, the silence between us became unbearable. I found myself standing outside his door, hand hovering just above the wood, unsure if I should knock or retreat. But my feet betrayed me, and before I knew it, I was tapping lightly against the door, a quiet plea for connection. "Ethan?" I called softly, trying to steady my voice, though it trembled with the unspoken tension. "Can we talk?" There was a long pause, a moment where I wondered if he'd ignore me entirely. But then came the sound of footsteps. The door opened, and when I saw him standing there, something in his eyes stopped me cold. Gone was the usual guarded expression I'd grown so accustomed to. Instead, I saw something softer, more vulnerable. My heart ached in response. "Hey," he murmured, stepping aside, his body language inviting me in, yet somehow hesitant, as though unsure of what would come next. I stepped into his room, a place that had always felt familiar, neat and orderly. It mirrored him, I realized, a carefully curated facade. But the air between us now was thick with uncertainty. He motioned for me to sit on the bed, and I did, though every nerve in my body screamed to leave, to turn back, to pretend none of this had happened. But I didn't. I stayed. "I just want to check in," I said after a moment, my voice low, laced with something fragile. "About last night." Ethan winced, his shoulders hunching as though bracing for an impact I wasn't sure I was capable of delivering. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it was weird. I shouldn't have—" "Ethan," I interrupted gently, raising a hand to stop him. "It's okay. I'm not mad, I need to understand what's going on." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it. The quiet desperation in his eyes. His hands, normally steady, fidgeted nervously in his lap, betraying the turmoil inside. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, I saw his walls crack. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just feel really alone sometimes. And when Mom's gone, it's like the house just feels so empty. Even with you here." I felt a pang in my chest. I had been so consumed by my own loneliness, my own aching sense of absence since Laura left, that I hadn't considered how Ethan might be struggling with the same feelings. I had always prided myself on being a good father, but hearing him speak of his isolation hit harder than I could have anticipated. "Ethan," I began softly, my voice full of tenderness, "I'm sorry if I've made you feel that way. You're not alone. I'm here for you, always." He nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the floor like he couldn't bear to look me in the eye. "I know, but it's just not the same." I leaned forward slightly, wanting to bridge that distance between us. "What do you mean?" He took another deep breath, his hands clenched into fists now. "It's hard to explain," he murmured, as though speaking the words was a struggle. I want to be close to you, but not in the way I'm supposed to. And I don't know what to do with that." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and my stomach twisted. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell him it was just a phase, but something told me that this wasn't something I could brush off. Not anymore. "Ethan," I said cautiously, "I think you're confused. It's normal to feel—" "I'm not confused," he interrupted, his voice firm, his eyes locking with mine in a way that made my heart stutter. "I know what I feel, and I know it's not normal, but I can't help it." His words landed like a slap, and I found myself frozen. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. We sat there, the silence between us almost suffocating, as I processed what he had just said. There was a storm raging inside me, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. We never did speak of it again that night. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze where we tried to act like everything was normal. We ate dinner, discussed trivial things, the kind of conversations that felt shallow now compared to the gravity of what had just been shared. But all the while I could feel his eyes on me, a constant pressure that made my skin prickle. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over, though. My thoughts raced as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing down on me. Ethan's words echoed in my mind, his vulnerability, the rawness in his voice. It was impossible to push them aside. Finally, I got out of bed, my body moving on its own accord, as though driven by some force I couldn't explain. I stood outside his door, listening for any sound. When I was certain he was still awake, I whispered through the crack in the door, "Ethan?" There was no response, but I knew he had heard me. "Ethan, would you like to join me for tonight?" I asked, my voice tight with the emotion I could barely understand. "Are you sure?" His voice, soft and unsure, came from the other side. "Yes, son, I'd love to," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. The door opened, and without hesitation, Ethan stepped inside. He climbed onto my bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting nervously on his knees. I could feel his eyes on me, searching, questioning. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling, "please excite me like a mom." The words hit me like a physical blow, and my heart raced, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at him, my mind screaming for me to stop this, to say something, anything to end this madness, but I couldn't move. His eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and longing, held me captive. "This isn't," I began, but he cut me off. "Don't," he whispered urgently, his hand tightening on my arm. "Just let me stay, please." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart pounding in my chest. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking, "but we need to talk about this in the morning." He nodded, a small smile flickering across his lips. "Thank you," he murmured as he lay down beside me. I turned off the light, but the room was anything but dark. It pulsed with a strange energy I couldn't begin to understand. I lay there, unsure of what this meant, afraid of what it could become. But I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. The room was heavy with an unspoken tension, the kind that lingers in the air like a storm waiting to break. I turned around, and our eyes met, his gaze piercing, mine uncertain. It was as if the world had narrowed to that single moment, the space between us charged with something neither of us could name but both felt acutely. My heart raced, a frantic drumbeat in my chest, and I sat up, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. "This isn't okay," I told myself, though the words felt hollow even as they formed in my mind. My voice wavered when I finally spoke. "You need to go back to your room." He didn't move. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I don't want to," he said, his voice low but steady. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I felt exposed, as if he could see every doubt, every fear, every forbidden thought I'd tried to bury. "I don't care if it's wrong," he continued, his words slicing through the fragile barrier I'd built between us. "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." Before I could respond, before I could muster the strength to push him away, he reached out. His hand brushed against my cheek, the touch so soft, so reverent, that it sent a shiver down my spine. My resolve wavered, and I felt myself teetering on the edge of something I knew I shouldn't want, but couldn't bring myself to reject. "Ethan, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't—" He leaned in then, cutting off my protest with a kiss that was both tentative and insistent. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, to end this before it went any further. But my body betrayed me, frozen in the moment, caught between the weight of guilt and the pull of something I couldn't name. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The fear, the guilt, the impossibility of it all. There was only Ethan, his touch, his warmth, his desperation. And in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The kiss lingered, longer than it should have, longer than it had any right to. His lips were soft, hesitant, but there was an urgency behind them, a desperate need to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, brimming with a mix of fear, longing, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We can't. This isn't—" "I know it's wrong," he interrupted, his voice trembling. "But I don't care. I can't keep pretending, Dad. I can't keep hiding how I feel." His words hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was mistaken, that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be. But the conviction in his voice, the raw honesty in his gaze, made it impossible to deny that he truly believed what he was saying. And somewhere deep down, in a part of myself I didn't want to acknowledge, I felt it too. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix anything," he said, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and it made my pulse quicken despite my better judgment. "Just let me in, please." I pulled my hand away, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and guilt. "Ethan, this isn't about what I want. It's about what's right. And this This isn't right. He looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I know you think that, he said quietly, but I also know you don't really believe it. Not completely. His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Shame? Or was it the terrifying realization that a part of me didn't want to push him away? The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until something shifted. I looked him in the eyes, and I think he noticed it too. The tension between us transformed, morphing into something entirely different. Something that had been simmering beneath the surface for days, maybe longer. The kiss had evoked something in me that I couldn't ignore, something I didn't want to ignore. "Kiss me again, Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes widening in surprise. "What?" "Do it," I urged, my voice firmer now. "As you mentioned earlier, pretend to do what Laura would do." I didn't hold back anymore. Something had shifted in me, some barrier had crumbled, and I was no longer fighting the pull. Ethan leaned into me and we kissed again, this time with a different intensity, a deeper urgency. His hands moved with a confidence that surprised me, touching me in ways that felt both familiar and foreign. It was as if he had taken his role as Laura seriously, embodying her in a way that was both unsettling and intoxicating. The kiss deepened, and soon it was more than just a kiss. It was a collision of emotions, a release of everything we'd been holding back. I couldn't stop it, and I didn't want to. It was intense, sensitive, and from his side, I think, a bit hurtful. I don't know why, but he had thrown himself into the moment with a fervor that left me breathless. When it was over, he lay there beside me, both of us silent, neither of us knowing what to say. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, a mix of exhilaration and dread. "Are you okay, son?" I asked finally, my voice soft. "Yes, Dad," he replied, his tone equally quiet. "Don't worry about me. Let me go to the bathroom for a moment, and then let's just go to sleep." That was the last part I could remember. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but the memory of that moment, of the lines we'd crossed and the emotions we'd unleashed, stayed with me. It was a turning point, a moment that changed everything, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the kitchen. I sat at the table halfway through my coffee, the events of the night before replaying in my mind like a film I couldn't pause. My thoughts were a tangled mess, a mix of guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something that made my chest ache and my stomach twist. I had dozed off at some point while Ethan was in the bathroom, but sleep had been fleeting, restless, and filled with fragments of dreams I couldn't fully remember. Now, in the cold light of day, everything felt sharper, more real, and more terrifying. I heard footsteps on the stairs, soft and hesitant, and I didn't need to turn around to know it was Ethan. His presence seemed to fill the room before he even spoke, a quiet force that pulled at me even as I tried to resist. "Morning," he said softly, his voice tentative, as if he wasn't sure how I'd respond. I turned to face him, offering a small, strained smile. "Morning, coffee's on the counter." He nodded, walking over to pour himself a cup. For a moment we stood in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. The weight of what had happened last night hung over us like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Ethan," I began, setting my mug down with a soft clink. "We need to talk." He stiffened, his shoulders tensing as he turned to face me. "About last night?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything," I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. "I need to understand what's going on with you, what's going on with us." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. I feel like I've been holding this in for so long, and I couldn't anymore. I know it's wrong, Dad. I know that. But I can't help how I feel." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't really feel this way, that it was just confusion or a phase or something he'd grow out of. But the look in his eyes, raw, vulnerable, and utterly sincere, told me otherwise. This wasn't some fleeting thought or teenage rebellion. It was something deeper, something real, and it scared me more than I cared to admit. "Ethan," I said carefully, choosing my words with deliberate precision, "I need you to understand that what you're feeling, it's complicated, and it's not something we can just act on." He nodded, his expression pained. "I know," he said quietly, "but it doesn't make it go away." The room fell silent again, the weight of his confession hanging between us like a thick fog. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I didn't know how. This was uncharted territory, and I felt like I was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from falling. The rest of the day was awkward, to say the least. Ethan stayed in his room for most of it, and I tried to distract myself with chores and errands. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he'd looked at me last night, so raw and vulnerable, and to the way his touch had sent shivers down my spine. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened, and I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. By the time evening rolled around, I was sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, when Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked hesitant, his hands shoved into his pockets, but there was a determination in his eyes that made my heart race. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded, unable to find the words to refuse him. He walked over and sat down on the couch beside me, leaving a careful amount of space between us. "I'm sorry," he said after a long silence, "for making things weird. I didn't mean to. I just didn't know how to handle it." "I know," I said, my voice soft. "It's okay. We'll figure this out." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with so much vulnerability that it made my chest ache. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Of course not," I said immediately, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I could never hate you, Ethan. You're my son." He flinched slightly at the word, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "I just want to be close to you," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't care how, I need you." His words broke something inside me, and I pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as he buried his face in my shoulder. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'll always be here." For a moment, it felt like everything might be okay, that we could find a way to move past this and rebuild our relationship. But as he pulled back and looked up at me, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, I felt that familiar tension creeping back in. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As he stood to leave, I reached out and grabbed his hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we'll figure this out. Together." He smiled, a small, tentative smile that sent a pang of warmth through my chest. "I know we will," he said. And as he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was far from over. The lines we had drawn were already beginning to blur, and though I didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.